The thing about poison was that it rarely tasted like death. Sometimes it tasted like chamomile tea. Sometimes like warm bread and the familiar smell of the only home you had ever known. Sometimes it tasted like a stepmother's voice saying, "You are so lucky, Nellie, so lucky that I arranged this for you." Nellie Ashford was 23 years old, and she had spent the last 4 of those years believing that Marin Ashford, the woman her father had married 6 months before his lungs finally gave out, had done her a kindness. She believed it when Marin dismissed the household staff and kept only 2 servants loyal to herself alone. She believed it when the deed to the Ashford estate was quietly transferred into a trust she was never allowed to read. She believed it even when her younger brother, Cole, was sent away to a mountain monastery at 14, under the pretense of education and discipline, and his letters began arriving with whole paragraphs scratched out in dark ink. She believed it because grief does that. It makes you need the nearest warm thing to be good. The carriage hit a rut in the road, and Nellie pressed her palm flat against the wooden panel to keep herself from sliding. Outside the small window, the forest had swallowed the last of the afternoon light. The trees here were older than anything she had seen near Ashford Village. Black pine, dense and humorless, their roots lifting the road in long ridges like bones under pale skin. Somewhere beyond them, invisible still, stood Veyrath Keep. The seat across from her was occupied by a woman named Sora, the head housekeeper sent to collect the new staff. Sora had said exactly 4 things during the 3-hour journey: that the keep ran on schedule, that personal items were stored in designated trunks, that the Alpha King did not receive visitors in the North Wing, and that new maids were not to look directly at him if they happened to cross his path. Nellie had nodded to all 4. She was good at nodding. She had learned it young. The position had come through Marin, of course. An honor. Her stepmother had called it, folding her hands together in that practiced way she had, rings catching the candlelight. A placement at Veyrath Keep. Girls from this county would beg for such a thing. She had smiled while she said it. That particular smile, close-lipped, just slightly too controlled, was the one Nellie had never quite been able to read. Now, rattling through the dark forest toward a king's fortress she had never asked to enter, that smile returned to her like something she should have studied harder. She pressed it away. The keep appeared first as light. Torches at the outer wall, then lanterns hung along the iron gate, then the massive shape of the structure itself rising against the bruised sky. Towers of dark stone, steep slate roofs, narrow windows glowing amber from within. It was not a welcoming place. It had not been built to welcome. It had been built to outlast things. The carriage passed through the gate and Nellie noticed the guards. Not just their number, though there were many, but their stillness. They stood the way mountains stood. Whatever lived inside this place commanded something that did not need to raise its voice. She was shown to the servants' quarters with 5 other women, all arriving the same night. Their rooms smelled of cedar and lye soap, clean in a way that felt institutional rather than warm. Each bed had a folded uniform at its foot. Dark gray dress, white collar, white apron, black boots. Nellie sat on the edge of her mattress after the others had quieted and looked at the uniform in the dark. Her hands were steadier than they should have been. She had grown up in a house that became a trap so gradually she had not noticed the walls closing. She had learned to be still inside confinement. It was not a skill she was proud of, but it was the one she had. She dressed before dawn. The keep ran exactly as Sora had promised. Schedules were observed with the precision of someone who used order as a wall against chaos. Meals were prepared at fixed hours. Fires were lit in sequence through the corridors. Linens were changed, lamps trimmed, floors swept in a pattern that left no corner untouched. In her first 3 days, Nellie learned the geography of her permitted world. The east kitchen, the lower corridor, the great hall before the morning meal, the 2 receiving rooms on the ground floor, the long gallery where portraits of dead alphas stared at nothing. She was not permitted in the North Wing. She was not permitted on the upper floors without specific instruction. She was not permitted to ask questions about the Alpha King. She did not ask questions, but she listened. And what she heard, in pieces, between the clatter of pots and the whisper of two older maids near the linen cupboard, was this. Adrian Veyrath had not slept in 5 years. Not truly. He rested sometimes in the way a man lies down from exhaustion, without ever losing consciousness. But sleep, the real kind, the kind that restored something, had not come to him since the night his mate had died on the floor of the North Tower, and the keep had been cold in a particular way ever since. The maids said it differently to each other, depending on who was speaking. One said he was cursed. One said he was grieving. One said both were the same thing. Nellie said nothing. She carried the tray of morning coals down the east corridor and did not think about a man she was not permitted to look at. She was thinking about the letter. It had arrived tucked inside her uniform trunk. Not her own trunk, the one she'd brought from home, but the one the keep had issued her. She had found it at the bottom, beneath the folded aprons, pressed flat as though it had been placed there deliberately and some time ago. The handwriting was not Marin's. It was thin, sharp, precise, like a person who measured each stroke. The girl must be kept close to him. Proximity is required. Do not allow her to be reassigned. The bond will do the rest. That was all. No name, no seal, no address. Nellie had read it 4 times in the dark, sitting on the edge of her bed while the others slept. Then she had folded it carefully and pressed it into the lining of her boot, where it sat now against her ankle, like a coal that hadn't quite cooled. The bond will do the rest. She did not know what that meant. She did not know who had written it. She did not know why her arrival at this keep had been arranged months in advance by someone who was not her stepmother. Or perhaps by someone working alongside her stepmother, using her stepmother's offer as a door. What she knew was this. She had been placed here, not hired. Placed, like a piece on a board. And someone was waiting to see what happened next. On the 5th night, she made a mistake. It was not carelessness, or not only that. She had been given the task of refilling the oil lamps in the upper east corridor, a duty normally assigned to a senior maid who had taken ill. Sora had handed her the lamp oil and a list of 6 sconces, and told her to be done before the 8th bell. She was done before the 8th bell. But the 6th sconce on the list was in a corridor she had not been shown. She followed the passage until it curved left, and then the corridor changed. The floor went from worn oak to cold slate. The tapestries grew older and heavier, and the draft that came through the stones carried a different smell. Not lye soap and cedar. Something older. Pine resin and something metallic beneath it, like the air before a storm. She stopped. The door at the end of the corridor was open. Not open the way a door was left open by accident. Open the way a door was left open by someone who no longer cared what came through it. The room beyond was a study. She could see it in the low firelight. Shelves of books along every wall, a wide desk buried under maps and documents, 2 chairs angled toward the dying hearth. One of those chairs was occupied. She should have turned around. Instead, for reasons she would spend a long time afterward failing to explain, she took one more step forward. The man in the chair was not asleep. He was sitting completely still, forearms resting on his knees, head slightly bowed, staring at the embers in a way that had nothing to do with watching them. He was large, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed in a plain linen shirt and riding trousers as though he had sat down before intending to go somewhere and then forgotten to leave. His stillness was not peaceful. It was the stillness of something that had run out of ways to move. He lifted his head before she had made a sound. His eyes were gray, not the mild gray of winter cloud, but the gray of something harder, stone or iron, and they found her in the doorway with a directness that pulled the breath from her lungs without violence. She did not look away. She could not have said why. Every instruction, every learned instinct, every piece of quiet survival she had practiced for years said lower your eyes, step back, disappear. But the letter against her ankle was warm, and something in her, some part that had been watching the walls close for 4 years and was tired of pretending not to notice, held still instead. Neither of them spoke. The fire cracked once between them. Then Nellie took a slow breath, dipped her chin in something that was not quite a bow, and stepped back into the corridor. She pulled the door quietly to its original position, not closed, exactly as she had found it, and walked back the way she had come without rushing. Her hands did not shake until she reached the servant's stair. Then they shook for a long time. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark, listening to the keep settle around her, the old stones contracting in the cold, and thought about the letter in her boot, and the gray eyes in the firelight, and the particular way he had looked at her. Not with hunger, not with command, not even with suspicion, with recognition, as though he had been waiting, in that cold room, for something he could not name, and she had walked through the wrong door and given him a face to put to it. The bond will do the rest. She stared at the ceiling until dawn came gray and cold through the narrow window, and understood, with a calm that frightened her, that she had not been placed in this keep by accident. Someone had put her here for him. The question that kept her rigid until the morning bell was the one she could not yet answer. Whether they meant it to save him, or to destroy her. She told no one about the letter. This was not a decision made from strategy, though strategy would have led her to the same place. It was older than that, a reflex built from years of learning that the wrong word to the wrong person could close a door before you ever reached it. Marin had taught her that without meaning to, simply by being the kind of woman who collected information the way others collected debts. Quietly, patiently, and always with the intention of spending it at the worst possible moment. So Nellie kept the letter in her boot, and she kept her face smooth, and she went about the work. The work was not unpleasant. That surprised her. She had expected the keep to feel like a cage, and in certain ways it was, bounded by rules and corridors and a hierarchy she was only beginning to map. But there was something in its order that she had not anticipated. Predictability. After years of living inside Marin's household, where the atmosphere shifted without warning and the rules changed depending on what her stepmother needed them to be, there was a strange relief in a schedule that held fires at dawn, breakfast trays at the 6th bell, linens on Tuesdays and Fridays, oil lamps at dusk. She learned the rhythms of the place the way she would have learned the currents of a river. Not to fight them, but to move within them. To find the eddies where a person could stand still and not be swept. She also learned the gossip, because servants always talked, and Nellie had always known how to listen without appearing to. The Alpha King had not received visitors from outside the territory in 2 years. The last delegation that arrived from the Eastern Pax had been turned away at the gate, politely, with a letter of formal refusal written in the king's own hand, which the keep's senior advisor Lord Caston had described afterward as the most controlled expression of leave me alone he had ever read in 20 years of diplomatic correspondence. Adrian Veyrath did not eat in the Great Hall. He took his meals in the study, or not at all. He trained with the guard each morning in the outer yard, alone, before anyone else was awake. 3 of his senior wolves had left the keep in the past 2 years, not dismissed, but withdrawn by their own request, asking to be released to their home packs. It was said, in the careful way things were said among servants who valued their positions, that the king's wolf had become difficult. Unstable, one of the older maids murmured to another near the hearth, not knowing Nellie was close enough to hear, like something inside him stopped trusting the world to hold still. Nellie understood that particular feeling better than she would have liked to admit. On the 8th day, she was reassigned. Sora delivered the news without ceremony over the morning distribution of duties. Nellie would take over the North Corridor lamps, the Upper East study, and the preparation of the morning tray for the king's private rooms. The maid who had previously held that duty had requested a transfer to the lower kitchens. The request had been granted. Nellie watched Sora's face while she explained this. Sora's expression was professional, closed, entirely unrevealing. But the reassignment had come, and Nellie knew it without being able to prove it, from above. Not from Sora, not from any ordinary rotation of duties, from somewhere that had decided proximity was required. She carried the morning tray to the Upper East Corridor for the first time 2 days later. Porridge with honey, dark bread, a small pot of black tea, a cup of water that the keep's cook insisted on including even though, as far as anyone could tell, it was never touched. She knocked twice at the heavy door as Sora had instructed, left the tray on the small table in the antechamber, and withdrew. She did not see him. But when she came back an hour later to collect the empty dishes, the bread was gone, and the tea had been drunk, and the water, as always, was untouched. And on the edge of the tray, placed with a deliberateness that could not have been accidental, was a small piece of folded paper. Her name was on it. Not new maid, not girl. Her name. Nellie. She stood in the antechamber for a long moment, the empty tray in her hands, the paper sitting on its surface like a question she had not asked. Then she picked it up, folded it into her apron pocket, and went back downstairs. She did not open it until she was alone in the small closet off the linen room, where the spare candles were stored, door shut, a single taper lit against the dark. The handwriting was controlled, precise, and familiar in the way the letter in her boot was not. This was not the same hand. This was heavier, more direct. Ink pressed firmly into the paper as though whoever held the pen was accustomed to signing things that could not be taken back. You were in the wrong corridor 6 nights ago. I do not hold it against you. But I would know your name, and whether you gave it willingly to whoever sent you here. A.V. Nellie read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of the candle closet with her back against the shelving and stared at the flame until it steadied. He knew. Not everything. She was certain of that much. He did not know about the letter, did not know the specific shape of whatever plan had placed her here. But he had seen her in that doorway, and he had recognized something wrong about her presence, and instead of calling for the guard or dismissing her without explanation, he had written her a note with his own hand and asked her a question. Whether you gave it willingly. She took the candle stub from the shelf, smoothed the paper against her knee, and wrote 3 words beneath his. No, I did not. She left it on the morning tray the next day, tucked beneath the bread. The correspondence lasted 4 days before it became a conversation. It was not what she had intended. She had answered because silence felt like a lie, and she had survived enough of those to be tired of adding to their number. But each answer she gave him produced another question. Not demanding, not threatening, just relentlessly precise in the way of someone who had spent years listening to people tell him what he wanted to hear and had lost patience for it. Do you know who placed you here? She answered. I know the door they used, not the hand behind it. Are you in danger? She considered the letter in her boot for a long moment before writing. I don't know yet. Do you intend to find out? She had looked at that question for a long time. It was not the question of a man who expected passivity. It was the question of someone who was, in his own way, waiting to see what she was made of. She wrote, Yes. His reply came the next morning, placed not on the tray but slipped under the door of the servants' quarters before dawn, which meant he had come down to that floor himself in the night's last hours, rather than send it through any other hand. Then we may be useful to each other. Come to the study at the 9th bell tonight. Use the east stair. Tell no one. She almost didn't go. She sat on the edge of her bed at the 8th bell and listed every reason not to. She did not know this man. She knew his reputation, powerful, controlled, grief-hollowed, but reputation was a story people told about someone else, and stories could be built for any purpose. She had been placed here by a plan she didn't yet understand. Walking into a private meeting with the Alpha King could be exactly what that plan had been waiting for. But the letter in her boot said the bond will do the rest. And the bond, whatever it meant, whatever it was supposed to accomplish, was not something she had agreed to. It was something being done to her, around her, through her, without her knowledge or consent. She was tired of things happening to her without her consent. She went. The east stair was narrow and cold, lit by a single torch at the top landing. The study door was open. The fire was higher than it had been the night she'd stumbled into the wrong corridor. Someone had built it up deliberately. And the desk had been cleared to one side, 2 chairs placed opposite each other near the hearth, with the directness of someone who wanted no pretense of incidental meeting. He was standing when she entered, not seated this time, not still in that exhausted way. Standing with his arms at his sides, watching the door, and when she stepped through it, his expression shifted in a way so small she almost missed it. Something that might have been relief closed off quickly. She stopped a few feet inside the room and did not reach for the composure she usually kept ready. She was beyond composure. She was frightened and clear-eyed and done with pretending otherwise. "You know what I am," she said before he could speak. "You know something brought me here deliberately. I need you to tell me what a mate bond is and whether someone could use it as a weapon." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Adrian Veyrath sat down in the chair nearest the fire, rested his forearms on his knees in that posture she had seen before, the one that looked like exhaustion and was actually something closer to controlled grief, and said, in a voice that was low and entirely without pretense, "Sit down, Nellie. This is going to take a while." Outside, the wind moved through the black pines, and the keep held still around them, and the fire burned between 2 people who had both been placed in this room by someone else's design, and had both, without knowing it, just decided to stop following the script. The plan took 3 days to build, and Adrian built it the way he did everything, methodically, without waste, consulting only the people whose loyalty he had tested personally, rather than inherited by rank. Peter was one. A woman named Da, the keep's head archivist, who had served Adrian's father before him, and whose knowledge of land law and blood contracts was, according to Adrian, more precise than any lawyer in the Western Territories. And Sora, the head housekeeper, who revealed herself in that first planning meeting to be something considerably more than she appeared. She moved through the keep with the quiet authority of someone who had been Adrian's eyes in the servants' world for years, and who had known since Nellie's second day that something about her placement was wrong. "I flagged it to him immediately," Sora said without apology, when Nellie looked at her. The reassignment order came from outside the keep's chain of command. It had Lord Caston's seal, but not his handwriting. Someone forged it. "Caston himself?" Nellie asked. "No." Adrian said it with the certainty of someone who had already examined the question. "Caston is many things. He is not that." He paused. "But someone in his correspondence chain has been compromised. We're working on which one." The shape of the conspiracy was becoming clearer and uglier the more they pulled at its edges. Marin had not acted alone. She was the visible surface of something larger, a coalition of minor pack interests in the Western Lowlands, who had spent years trying to consolidate territorial claims, blocked repeatedly by the fact that the Ashford bloodline carried an old deed of land rights that predated 3 generations of pack expansion. As long as Nellie or Cole was alive and reachable, that deed could be challenged. The solution, for someone ruthless enough, was elegant in its cruelty. Remove Cole entirely. Place Nellie in proximity to the most powerful unmated alpha on the continent. Allow the mate bond to emerge, and then leverage whatever claim or chaos that created to force a settlement. It did not matter to them whether the bond was used to control Adrian through Nellie, or to discredit Nellie entirely, or to create enough political disruption that the land question got buried in the noise. Any outcome served the purpose. They had built a plan with multiple exits. They're not wrong that the bond is real, Adrian said. He said it to the map on the desk, not to her, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than making a confession. I noticed it the first night you were in the wrong corridor. I've been aware of it since. The room was very still. Nellie looked at the side of his face and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not warmth exactly. Not the soft thing she associated with the word feeling, because that word had become contaminated by everything she'd been through. It was more structural than that. The sense of a weight being distributed more evenly, of something she'd been carrying alone shifting its center. She did not say anything about it. She said, "What does it mean for the plan?" He turned to look at her then, and the gray eyes were direct in the way they always were. No performance in them, no attempt to manage what she might think. It means the people who designed this are expecting a predictable response. They're expecting the bond to make me protective in a way that overrides judgment. They're expecting it to make you confused and dependent. He paused. They're going to be wrong about both. She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said. They are. They moved on the 5th day before dawn. Not an army. Adrian had been explicit about that. A visible military deployment toward the northern range would alert whoever was monitoring the situation, and the contract on Cole was not yet finalized, but it was close. Speed and quiet were more valuable than force. 6 wolves, all hand-chosen by Adrian, all of whom shifted for the journey and covered ground in the dark at a pace no horse could match. Adrian himself rode, a concession to Nellie's presence, because she could not shift and would not be left behind, and he had not suggested she should be. She had not thanked him for that. She did not think he wanted thanks for the obvious. The carriage was plain, unmarked, moving fast on the mountain road with a driver Peter had chosen and 2 outriders who looked like ordinary travelers and were not. Nellie sat inside with a wool blanket over her lap and the cold coming through the panels and watched the last stars disappear behind the peaks. Adrian rode alongside the carriage for the first hour, and then, at the point where the road narrowed and the trees pressed close, he pulled his horse even with her window. "We'll stop at the Valley way station before the final ascent," he said. "Peter's man there will have current information on the Saron building. We don't go up until we know the number of guards and where Cole is being held. And if the contract moves before we get there, it won't." He said it with a quiet finality that was not arrogance. It was the voice of a man who had sent 3 of his 6 wolves ahead 2 days prior, specifically to ensure that nothing moved until he arrived, and who had given them instructions she suspected involved making their presence felt in ways that did not require explanation. She nodded. He held her gaze through the carriage window for 1 beat longer than information required. Then he rode forward toward the head of the column, and she turned back to the dark trees and allowed herself, for the first time in days, to be frightened. Not of what was ahead, but of what she was beginning to feel, which was worse in some ways because she had no protocol for it. She had loved someone once, or believed she had. A young man from the neighboring estate, before her father died, before Marin arrived and the world contracted. He had stopped coming to call within 3 months of the funeral, and she had heard later, through the particular cruelty of village gossip, that he had told someone she was too sad now, too heavy, that grief had made her difficult. She had packed that information into the same interior room where she kept everything else she couldn't afford to examine, and had not unlocked it since. The mate bond was not love. She understood that intellectually. It was recognition, a pull, a resonance, something biological and ancient that did not consult the person it inhabited. She did not have to feel anything about Adrian Veyrath simply because some older mechanism in her blood had registered his existence as significant. She was very aware, sitting in the cold carriage on the mountain road, that the intellectual understanding and the actual feeling were not currently in the same place. The way station was a low stone building at the valley's edge, smelling of horse and wood smoke and the sharp green of pine resin. Peter's contact was a lean older man named Rast, who had the watchful eyes of someone who made his living noticing things other people missed. He had information, and it was not good. The contract had been moved up. Not completed, not yet. But the second party, the pack making the purchase, had sent a representative to Saron 2 days prior. The representative was still on the mountain. The finalization was expected within 48 hours. Adrian absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he turned to Peter, spoke 4 sentences in a low voice, and turned back to the room. "We go up tonight," he said. "We don't wait for morning." The ascent took 3 hours on a path that was not a road, more a suggestion of direction through rock and root, and the remnants of what might once have been a shepherd's trail. Nellie climbed it in riding boots that were not made for climbing, with Adrian's hand at her elbow on the worst sections. Not gripping, not controlling, just present. A point of steadiness she could choose to use or not. She used it. The monastery was dark when they reached the outer wall. Not abandoned dark. There were lights in the lower windows, a guard at the main gate, the faint smell of cooking fire and something underneath it, older and more stale, that spoke of a building being used for long-term containment rather than habitation. What followed was not a battle. It was a precision operation carried out by 6 wolves who knew their assignments, and an alpha king who moved through the darkness with a controlled efficiency that Nellie observed from the sheltered position Adrian had placed her in, against the outer wall, behind Peter, with explicit instructions to stay there unless something went wrong. She stayed. 12 minutes. That was all it took. The guards were disarmed, not killed. Adrian had been clear about that, and the clarity of it told her something about the kind of man he was that she added to the accumulating record she was keeping without meaning to. The representative from the purchasing pack was secured in the gatehouse. Lord Caston's compromised secretary, who had traveled with the representative as a facilitator, was found in the upper hall and taken without resistance. Peter found Cole in the north cellar. Nellie heard him before she saw him, a voice she had not heard in 8 months, calling out at the sound of the door, rough with disuse and wariness, and something that cracked open in the middle when he heard her answer him. He was thinner. There were marks on his wrists from restraints, old enough to have healed to scars, which meant they had not been used recently, but had been used. He was 20 years old, and he looked at her in the torchlight with an expression that broke her open and rebuilt her in the same moment. She crossed the cellar in 4 steps and held him, and he held her back, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that language was adequate for. When she finally pulled back and looked at his face, Cole looked past her shoulder at the figure standing in the doorway. Adrian, still, watchful, giving them the full space of the moment without intruding on it. "Who is he?" Cole said quietly. Nellie glanced back at Adrian. He met her eyes with that gray steadiness she had come to read as something close to patience. Not the passive kind, but the kind that had decided she was worth waiting for. "Someone who helped," she said. It was not the whole truth. She was not ready to speak the whole truth yet. But Cole, who had always been perceptive in the way of people who have spent time alone with silence, looked at her face and then back at Adrian and said nothing more. They descended the mountain in the hours before dawn, Cole wrapped in a borrowed cloak, the captured men bound and under guard, the contract, the document itself, the original, in Nellie's hands because Adrian had placed it there without being asked, understanding without explanation that she needed to be the one holding it. She carried it the whole way down. At the base of the mountain, where the valley road met the way station, Adrian came to walk beside her while the others prepared the horses. The sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, the dark blue going thin and cold above the peaks. He did not speak immediately. Neither did she. They had developed, over the weeks of careful correspondence and careful proximity, a comfortable literacy of silence, the ability to be present without filling the space, which Nellie suspected neither of them had often found with another person. "Marin," she said finally, "She's already being handled," he said. "I sent the order before we left the keep. By the time we return, she will have been summoned to answer formal charges before the Territorial Council. The estate trust will be frozen pending investigation." He paused. "Your father's solicitor, the original one before Marin replaced him, is still alive. He has documents." Nellie exhaled slowly. "You found all of that before we left." "I had 3 days." She looked at him. In the gray pre-dawn light, he looked tired in a way he usually kept hidden. Not weak, but human. The kind of tiredness that lived behind the eyes and didn't touch the posture. 5 years of not sleeping. She thought about that now, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. Because before it had felt like information, and now it felt like something else. "Adrian," she said. His name. The first time she had used it directly. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the plan, for the note. The first one, asking whether I came willingly." She held his gaze. "You didn't have to ask. You could have simply investigated and managed it and never told me what you found." He was quiet for a moment. "You deserved to know," he said. "It was your life." "Most people don't think of it that way." "Most people," he said, with a flat simplicity that held no bitterness, "have not given much thought to what other people deserve." The horses were ready. Cole was already mounted, watching her with quiet eyes from across the road. The sky was going pink above the eastern peaks. Nellie folded the contract under her arm and turned toward the horses, and felt, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the relief, beneath the thing she was still not ready to name, the specific sensation of a life beginning to belong to her again. The Territorial Council convened 12 days after their return to Veyrath Keep. It was not a small proceeding. Adrian had ensured that. The charges were formal, documented, presented with the kind of evidentiary weight that left no room for the particular social maneuvering that minor nobility relied on when they needed a room to look the other way. Daw, the archivist, had spent those 12 days assembling a record that was, by any measure, devastating. The forged transfer of the Ashford Estate Trust, the purchase of the Siron Monastery under a false company name, the contract for Cole's sale, the intercepted correspondence between Marin and the PAC representative, and the testimony of the original Ashford solicitor, a small, precise man named Garrett, who had been quietly removed from his position 4 years ago, and had spent the intervening time keeping meticulous copies of everything he'd been told to destroy. Nellie sat at the council table. This had required a brief negotiation. The council's procedural tradition placed the complainant in a separate chamber, represented by an appointed speaker. Adrian had reviewed the tradition, agreed it was the established practice, and then informed the council that Miss Ashford would be seated at the table as a material witness and primary claimant, and that if anyone wished to object, they were welcome to do so in writing, to him in advance of the session. No one had objected in writing. She wore a deep blue dress that Sora had found for her in the Keep's guest stores. Wool, well cut, with a white collar that was simple rather than decorative. She had pulled her hair back herself. She did not look like someone performing gravity. She simply was it. Marin arrived under guard. Nellie had prepared herself for this moment, in the way she had prepared herself for most difficult things, by deciding in advance what she would and would not allow herself to feel in public. She had expected to feel rage. What she felt instead, watching Marin walk into the council chamber with that controlled posture and close-lipped expression she had worn through 4 years of careful theft, was something quieter and more final. Clarity, the specific clarity of seeing something you have spent years almost understanding suddenly come fully into focus. Marin looked at her once, just once, across the width of the room, with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession. Calculation, assessment, and then, when she registered the composition of the room, the weight of documentation on the table, and Adrian Veyrath seated at its head, something that might have been the first genuine emotion Nellie had ever seen on her face. Fear, It did not make Nellie glad. It made her tired in a way that was almost peaceful, the way you feel when you have carried something heavy for a very long distance and finally set it down. The council session lasted 4 hours. Marin's appointed representative attempted, twice, to introduce the argument that the estate transfer had been made with Nellie's implicit consent as a grieving daughter who had been incapable of managing her own affairs. Garrett dismantled this argument with the methodical calm of a man who had been waiting 4 years to say what he knew. The forged council seal was presented. The shell company's financial trail was presented. The contract for coal was presented. And at that point the room went very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something crosses from allegation into undeniable fact. Cole sat against the wall behind Nellie, not at the table. He was still thin, still carrying the particular stillness of someone who had spent too long in a small space. But his eyes were clear and his back was straight, and when the contract was read aloud, he did not flinch. He had asked Nellie, the night before, whether she needed him to speak. She had told him that Garrett's testimony was sufficient, that he did not have to perform his own suffering for a room full of people who should have protected him better. He had looked at her for a long moment and then said, quietly, that she had become someone their father would have recognized. She had held that sentence somewhere internal and had not let herself take it apart until later. Alone. The ruling came before the 6th bell. Marin was found culpable on all primary charges. The estate trust was dissolved, and the Ashford holdings returned to their rightful heirs. The shell company's assets, which included the Ciron property, were seized. The PAC representative who had attempted to purchase Cole's location was formally censured, and his PAC placed under a territorial trade restriction that would cost them considerably more than whatever they had hoped to gain. The compromised secretary from Caston's office was dismissed and referred for separate proceedings. Caston himself, cleared of direct involvement but implicated in negligence, offered his resignation. Adrian accepted it without drama and appointed Daw in his place, which produced a silence in the room that Nellie interpreted as surprise, and he seemed entirely unbothered by. Marin was sentenced to exile from the Western Territories and the permanent removal of all titles and claims. It was not execution. Nellie had known it would not be, and she had made her peace with that before the session began. Exile was not nothing. Exile meant that the woman who had dismantled her family with such patient precision would spend the remainder of her life outside the world she had been so determined to possess. It meant she would never sit in a room again and be treated as someone whose word had weight. It was enough. That evening, after the council had emptied and the documentation had been collected, and Cole had been taken by Sora to a proper set of guest rooms, and fed something substantial for the first time in longer than Nellie wanted to calculate, she found herself alone in the Upper East Corridor. She was not sure how she had gotten there specifically. Her feet had simply carried her to the place she had come to associate with the beginning of this, the corridor where she had followed the wrong passage 6 weeks ago and found an open door and a man staring at embers with nothing left to say to them. The door to the study was open again. She stood in the doorway. Adrian was at the desk this time, not the chair, working through a stack of documents that had presumably accumulated during the days of preparation and travel and proceedings. He looked up when she appeared, and did the thing he always did. Took in her face with that complete attention, reading what was there without commentary. "It's done," she said. "Yes." "Cole is safe." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The fire was lower than usual, and the room smelled of candle wax and old paper, and the faint pine cold that came through the stones at night. She had stood in this doorway once before in a state of pure confusion, and now she stood in it in a state of pure clarity, which was different, and in some ways harder, because confusion had allowed her to defer certain things. She could not defer them now. "I need to ask you something," she said. He set down the pen he'd been holding. "The bond," she said. "What you told me in the beginning, that you noticed it the first night. What does that mean for you? Not politically, not practically." She held his gaze. "What does it mean?" He was quiet long enough that the candle on the desk guttered once in a draft and steadied. When he spoke, his voice was the same as always, low, direct, without performance. But there was something underneath it she had not heard before. Something that had been held in reserve for a long time. "It means," he said carefully, "that for the first time in 5 years, I slept." She went still. "The second night after you arrived," he said. "I didn't understand it immediately. I woke before dawn and thought it was an anomaly. Then it happened again. And again." He paused. "I had spent 5 years sitting in that chair watching the fire go out, because the dark behind my eyes was worse than the dark in the room. And then, you were in the wrong corridor, and I looked up, and something settled." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not telling you this to make a claim on you. I'm telling you because you asked me a direct question, and you deserve a direct answer." Nellie walked into the room. She did not move quickly. She walked to the desk and stood on the opposite side of it, and looked at him. Really looked, in the way she had been carefully not doing for 6 weeks, because looking too carefully at something you wanted was a vulnerability she hadn't been able to afford. He looked tired. Still always, that bone-deep tiredness behind the gray eyes. He looked like a man who had held a very large weight alone for a very long time, because there had been no one he trusted enough to set it down near. She thought about the note slipped under the servant's door before dawn, because he hadn't wanted any other hand to carry it. She thought about the contract placed in her hands on the mountain, because he understood it needed to be hers to hold. She thought about you, deserved to know. It was your life, said in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who considered this obvious. She thought about the difference between a man who had told her she was too sad, too heavy, too much, and this one, who had looked at her in the worst weeks of her life and written her a note asking whether she'd come willingly. "I'm not ready to call it what it is," she said. Her voice was steady. "Not yet. I need more time than 6 weeks to trust a word I spent years watching people use wrong." "I know," he said. "But I'm not leaving," she said. "And I'm not pretending I don't feel it." She held his gaze. "I just need it to be chosen. Not recognized. Chosen." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood from the desk, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and came around it, and stopped an arm's length away and said, "Then we choose it, when you're ready, at whatever pace you need." He paused. "I've waited 5 years for something I couldn't name. I can wait longer for something I can." She looked up at him in the low candlelight and felt the mate bond for the first time without the filter of fear, felt it as it actually was, underneath all the weight that had been piled on top of it by other people's plans. It was not the consuming, destabilizing thing she'd braced for. It was quieter than that. Steadier. It felt, with a precision that startled her, like the feeling of a door opening. She had always known what to do with open doors. She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, simply, the way you take hold of something real. He closed his fingers around hers and did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. 6 months later, Nellie Ashford stood in the great hall of Veyrath Keep as its Luna. The ceremony had been small by political standards and enormous by hers. Cole standing at her left in a new coat that fit him properly, his wrists healed, his eyes no longer carrying the flat watchfulness of captivity. Daw seated in the council row with the expression of someone who had seen a great deal of history and was satisfied with how this particular chapter had resolved. Sora standing near the door in her usual position, which was exactly where Sora always stood, close enough to manage anything that needed managing, removed enough to maintain that she was simply staff. Adrian had written the vows himself. He had shown them to her 3 days before, and asked if she wanted to change anything. She had read them twice, and then looked at him and said, "No, They were right, and he had nodded in the way he nodded when something settled into place. The vows were not elaborate. They did not invoke destiny or bond or the will of the moon, though Nellie had come, in her own time and on her own terms, to feel that something older than either of them had known what it was doing. The vows said, "I choose you. I will continue to choose you. Not because I must, but because you are the person I want beside me when the doors open and when they close." She had not cried during the ceremony. She had been afraid she might, which was a different kind of strength, knowing the feeling was there and choosing where it was allowed. She had cried afterward, alone with Cole in the small garden off the east corridor, while he held her hand and said nothing, because he was her brother, and he had always known when silence was the right language. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Politics did not simplify because two people chose each other. The Western Territory disputes required 3 years of careful negotiation before a stable agreement was reached. There were councils and delegations and seasons of exhausting diplomatic work that Nellie approached with the particular combination of patience and precision she had spent her childhood being forced to develop and had finally found a use for. She was good at it. Better, Adrian told her once, than anyone he had worked with, because she understood from the inside what it felt like to be managed rather than heard, and she refused to do it to others. Cole remained at the keep for 2 years, recovering, studying, slowly rebuilding the person that 8 months of isolation had interrupted. Then he went home, to the Ashford estate, restored, its accounts untangled, the solicitor Garrett reinstalled in his proper position. He wrote regularly, letters without scratched-out paragraphs, and visited when the seasons allowed. He had their father's handwriting and their mother's stubbornness, and watching him grow back into himself was the quietest and most complete form of justice Nellie had ever witnessed. Maureen was never heard from again. Nellie did not look for her. The woman had taken 4 years and a great deal of damage in exchange for an exile that was, in the end, the only life available to her. It was not a satisfying ending in the dramatic sense. It was simply the ending that had occurred. And Nellie had made peace with the fact that not everything broken resolves with noise. Some things simply stop. Adrian slept every night. This was not a small thing. Nellie understood it as the measure it was, the kept promise of something that had no language, the evidence of a wound that had not healed, but had found at last a way to rest. He was not a changed man in the way stories sometimes described change, sudden and total and tinged with transformation. He was the same man, only more present in his own life. Less braced. The gray eyes were the same, but what lived behind them had shifted, like a window that had been stuck, and then, one ordinary morning, finally opened. He told her once, late at night with the fire low, and her head against his shoulder in the chair by the hearth of the study where all of this had begun, that he had not expected the bond to feel like this. She asked him what he had expected. He said he had expected it to feel like need, like hunger, like something that would demand. She asked what it felt like instead. He was quiet for a moment, and she felt the steadiness of him, the particular warmth of a person who has decided to be somewhere and means it. Like being allowed to put something down, he said, and knowing it will still be there in the morning. Nellie turned her face into his shoulder and let the fire settle, and the keep breathe around them. Old stones and familiar dark and the smell of pine coming cold through the window. And did not answer, because she did not need to. She felt it too. Exactly like that. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.